Our focus this morning has very much been on an empty tomb. And for many of us who have gathered here, the use of the word empty brings with it not a message of disappointment or disillusionment or even despair, but instead quite the opposite. This proclamation that the tomb was empty brings with it much good news. News of peace, news of victory, news of wonder and awe. And yet when the first witnesses looked into the tomb and saw that it was empty, peace did not flood their souls, nor a dance of victory flow from their being. Rather, seeing the emptiness, they were overwhelmed with fear and panic and much dread. Listen to how Mark's Gospel records the event. Saturday evening, when the Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went out and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. On the way, they were asking each other, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" But as they arrived, they looked up and saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe sitting on the right side. The women were shocked. But the angel said, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He has risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you before he died." The women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. Have you ever experienced fear? Or encountered something so frightening that it sends you into a panic, or it immobilizes you? One of my all-time favourite news clippings is this story from Associated Press, and the story's been around now for quite some time, so if you've heard it before, just bear with me. But if you've never heard it before, hold on to your socks because you're in for a treat. Linda Burnett was visiting her in-laws in Florida, and while there she went to a nearby Winn-Dixie supermarket to pick up some groceries. Several people noticed her sitting in her car with the windows rolled up and her eyes closed, with both hands behind her head. One customer who had been at the store for a while became concerned and walked over to the car. He noticed that Linda's eyes were now open and she looked very strange. He asked her if she was okay, and Linda replied that she'd been shot in the back of the head and had been holding her brains in for over an hour. The man called the police and paramedics, who broke into the car because the doors were locked and Linda refused to remove her hands from her head. When they finally got in, they found that Linda had a clump of bread dough on the back of her head. A Pillsbury biscuit canister had exploded from the heat, making a loud noise that sounded like a gunshot, and the clump of dough hit her in the back of the head. When she reached to find out what it was, she felt the dough and thought that it was her brains. She initially passed out, but quickly recovered. and tried to hold in her brains for over an hour until someone noticed and came to her aid. Fear can do that, can't it? It just grips you and your judgment and decision making goes out the door. And I want to suggest that that's something of what it would have been like for these women who had spent the last few years with Jesus. They'd come to know him as their teacher and friend and promised Messiah, but the last few days, having witnessed the execution of the one who had promised to save them, all their dreams had come to a grinding halt. Their lives had been shattered and their plans had been put on hold. And why? Put simply, because death does that. And so as an act of mourning, as a final act of love and devotion, these traumatized women bravely returned to the place where Jesus was buried. And laden with burial spices, they arrive at the tomb ready to put the story of Jesus to an end. Because this is how you grieve. And this is how you mourn. This is what you do when faced with death and loss. And as terrible as it was, the women's actions tell us that they could cope with the death of Jesus. But what do you do when faced with an empty tomb? After all, there was no support group, there was no helpline, no one could take their hand and say, there, I know how you feel. How incredibly frightening. In that one moment, death was shattered, and the world that they knew was turned upside down. Because it wasn't just an empty tomb that they faced, but a young man clothed in a white robe who says to them, and I love this line, "You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified," says the angel. "He isn't here. He's risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body." Yes, they could see that. But don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, he goes on to say. "Go," continues the angel, "and tell the disciples that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. Don't be alarmed. Go." Yet despite this glimmer of hope that Jesus is ahead of them, how do the women respond? The women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. Now let's just pause here for a moment, because the women are standing where we stand. Jesus had not appeared to them yet. He hadn't spoken their names yet. Nor had he asked them to touch his wounded hands and side. So in one sense, that must have been frightening, because they were invited to experience something new. A new life, a new reality, a new certainty that the story of Jesus does not end with death. And that God has done something new, something up until that point in time so inconceivable. The crucified one is now the risen one. But he has risen to a new life rather than simply more of the same life. So Just a side note before I commence to wrap up this morning. In your English translation, we have three endings to the Gospel of Mark. We have what I call the original ending, which ends at verse 8, with the women in fear, trembling, not saying anything to anyone. And then we have two more endings, a shorter ending and a longer ending. However, scholars today will tell you that they aren't the original endings of Mark, that over the centuries, as people have read the ending and thought, oh, that's a bit abrupt, they've added to Mark's gospel. There are some who go further and say today that we've lost the end of Mark's gospel, hence the other two endings that we have, which is plausible. There are some commentators that go a step further who say not only have we lost the end of Mark's gospel, but we've lost the beginning of Mark's gospel as well. Not sure. I don't think that's as plausible, but that's just my opinion. What I think, and once again, this is my opinion, this is why I think Mark's gospel finishes so abruptly. Because I think that Mark's gospel is a circular gospel. Just as the women are invited to experience life anew, the gospel writer invites the reader, the one who can see, and the listener, the one who can hear, to encounter Jesus anew, afresh. And this is how we are to do this. God does not require that we pick up and move somewhere new, but to live in the new. You see, Mark's gospel commences in Galilee. And it's there that we first encounter Jesus. So by calling us back to Galilee, Mark invites us to walk with Jesus again, and to live the good news story of Jesus again, and to be reborn again. But this time he invites the reader to do so in light of the cross and resurrection. And then when we go through life, we read the gospel again, and we return to the resurrection scene once again at the end of the gospel, Mark calls us back to Galilee again, inviting us on this circular route, always bringing us back to the one who has gone ahead of us, always bringing us back to Galilee. And why? Because when we think that we're finally caught up with Jesus, he's on the move again. So the chase continues, onwards and onwards, this playing of game of catch. Jesus is always on the move. This is the truth of the resurrection and the truth of the Easter story. Jesus has moved on. He has gone ahead of us. So our task is to play catch up, to chase after him. He is going back to Galilee, and we need to follow him there, back to the beginning, so that we can soak ourselves again and again and again into the experiences of Jesus, into his healing and into his miracles and into his life-changing teaching. But most of all, we need to proclaim our experiences, our renewed life with Jesus, to a broken world. Or to put it somewhat bluntly, the resurrection is not the end of the story. We're told to go into the story so that we can tell others of this story of Jesus. So let me finish. This is the good news. Easter is not about fear, but about freedom from fear. Easter is not about inner turmoil, but about peace. Easter is not about dread, but all about love. Easter is not about setting blame or inward shame, but about forgiveness. After all, Easter is not just about loss or death, but all about life and hope. May God bless you.